a cork-heeled platform shoe in a garbage can, a makeup bag on a footpath, a diary in the gutter, and keys to an apartment nobody would ever come home to. That's what was left of Revel Balmain, scattered across 4 suburban streets in Sydney like breadcrumbs from a nightmare. The investigation that followed into her mysterious disappearance would ultimately reveal an extremely dark side to her supposedly ideal life. Revel Balmain was 22 years old in November 1994. Born in July 1972, she'd grown up around Newcastle on the New South Wales coast. She was a dancer and a model, and by all accounts she was good at both. She'd already completed 3 6-week tours of Japanese cabarets working as a hostess, and she had a 4th trip lined up. She'd moved to Sydney earlier that year to chase bigger opportunities in the entertainment industry, settling into a unit in the upscale suburb of Bellevue Hill. She'd also recently started seeing a man named Piers Fisher Pollard, a writer and photographer, and he'd later describe her as generous and fun-loving. But modeling and dancing don't always pay the rent on time, particularly not in a city like Sydney, and Revel had taken up more illicit work on the side to cover the gap. She worked under the name Misha for a high-end agency called Select Companions, which was run by a married couple, Jane King and Zoran Stanojevic. Zoran was also the agency's principal driver, responsible for ferrying the women to and from their quote-unquote appointments. The plan, according to those who knew her, was to save enough money from this to leave the industry behind and focus entirely on her more mainstream entertainment career. The 5th of November started out ordinary enough. Revel had arranged to catch a train up to Newcastle to have lunch with her mother at the station, but she never showed. Her mother waited, but the train came and went without her daughter on it. What happened instead was this. At around 4 in the afternoon, Revel contacted her boss at Select Companions to confirm she'd arrived at an appointment. The client was a 26-year-old man named Gavin Owen Samer, who lived on McNair Avenue and worked in a factory for his family's clothing business. At 5:50 p.m., Revel called the agency again and said the appointment was over, that she was leaving. According to a statement Samer later gave to police, Revel didn't actually leave. He claimed she'd entered into a private arrangement with him to stay longer, for cash, outside the agency's books. This would allow her to make additional money and cut the agency out of their cut of the action, so to speak. Samer told police he eventually drove her to the nearby Red Tomato Inn at about 7 p.m. that evening and dropped her off. That was reportedly the last time anyone saw Revel Balmain alive. 2 days after Revel vanished, her personal effects started turning up across the Kingsford area. A cork-heeled platform shoe was found in a trash bin, or as the sources say, a rubbish bin. Then her makeup bag appeared on a footpath, and her diary was recovered from a gutter. The keys to her Bellevue Hill apartment were also later found nearby. Interestingly, these items were spread across 4 different streets, all within a short radius of Samer's McNair Avenue residence. People don't casually drop their house keys, their diary, and a shoe in separate locations across a suburb. At least not last I checked. These items were separated from each other and from their owner in a way that suggests something violent and chaotic. Revel's disappearance was reported to police, and the investigation eventually zeroed in on Gavin Owen Samer as the primary person of interest. A coroner's inquest commenced in 1998 under New South Wales Deputy State Coroner John Abernethy, and in May 1999 he delivered his findings. Abernethy concluded that Revel had been slain by a person or persons unknown. He noted that Gavin Samer certainly had the opportunity to harm her, but that no plausible motive had ever emerged. Critically, the inquest fell short of recommending charges, and Samer was never arrested. In 2008, police conducted a second forensic examination of the McNair Avenue property using technology that hadn't been available during the original search. Advances in forensic science had opened up possibilities that simply didn't exist in 1994, and detectives went back through the house with fresh tools and fresh eyes. The results reportedly suggested that Ravel had been slain inside the house, but even with improved forensic tools, the case didn't advance to a prosecution. The evidence wasn't enough, or at least not enough for the standard required in a criminal court. For nearly 3 decades, the investigation had essentially one lane: Gavin Owen Samer, the last known client. But in September 2023, a television investigation aired new information that sent the case in a different direction entirely. The focus shifted to Zoran Stanojevic, the co-owner of Select Companions. And let's just say Zoran had his own troubles with the law. In December 2021, he was arrested on charges related to shoplifting and possession of stolen goods, reportedly connected to organized criminal activity. And honestly, who could have guessed that someone in such a shady business had an organized crime connection? Not me, that's for sure. That said, none of those charges were connected to Ravel's case, but his name was back in the frame. Here's the interesting thing about Zoran. His story shifted. 10 days after Revel was reported missing, he told police he wasn't working the night she disappeared, claiming he was home with his wife Jane, who was pregnant at the time. Jane would later contradict this account, saying that he wasn't there at all. There were also questions about money, and according to Jane's testimony at the inquest, Revel owed the agency a small sum of money. She had allegedly agreed to pay Zoran the same night that she disappeared. Zoran denied any knowledge of this arrangement, but a pager message sent to Revel's device the morning after she vanished told a different story. It read, in effect, that she should call Zoran to arrange settlement of her account. That pager message is haunting, and it suggested that he potentially was providing an alibi, which would suggest that he didn't know she was missing. In February 2024, the New South Wales Deputy State Coroner ordered a second inquest into Revel's disappearance, which opened in April 2024. As of early 2026, the inquest remains unresolved and ongoing, apparently due to scheduling issues and issues related to finding some of the witnesses. Both Gavin Samer and Zoran Stanojevic have drawn scrutiny, but there are reasons to question whether either could be directly responsible. In Samer's case, while he was the last confirmed person to see Revel Balmain, the absence of a clear motive has always been a major weakness. Investigators have long noted that opportunity alone isn't enough, and despite renewed forensic efforts, nothing has met the threshold required for charges. There's also the inherent doubt that someone who was on the books as being with Revel that night would do something like this. If Samer was responsible, he would have had to have known that he would be the prime suspect from the very start, which in my view makes him somewhat less likely to have been responsible. That said, criminals act in the heat of passion, and quite often aren't thinking rationally at all, and there is the report that suggested that she was slain in his residence. Of course, that report was generated 14 years after the crime, which is inherently problematic from an evidentiary standpoint to begin with. Zoran's situation is different but equally uncertain. His alleged connections to organized crime and later charges related to stolen goods paint a troubling picture. Of course, I have to admit that none of those allegations are directly tied to the disappearance itself. His inconsistent statements and financial dispute with Ravel raise suspicion, yet they don't establish involvement. Zoran's reasoning for acting suspiciously may simply be because he was operating a business of extremely questionable legality. Critically, Revel operated within a high-risk environment, where off-book arrangements may have occurred. That broader context means that she could have perhaps met with a second client that night that has so far completely flown under police radar. It's also always possible that she was the victim of trafficking, especially given that she was already working for someone with alleged mob connections. In fact, it's quite possible she was already a trafficking victim at the time she disappeared. We simply don't have enough evidence to know for certain. And that's where we stand right now, with two separate persons of interest who have attracted serious scrutiny from investigators. Her family has spent more than 30 years in a limbo that most of us can't imagine. What's left of Revel is a scattered collection of personal effects and far too many unanswered questions. Someone in Sydney knows what happened to Revel that evening, and so far, they haven't said anything. At 7 in the morning on March 24, 2020, a 65-year-old criminal defense attorney kissed his wife goodbye. He told her he had a client meeting later that day, and with that he walked out of her Deerfield, Illinois home. 17 hours later, he sent his final text message, and then, just like that, Barry Bosch's ceased to exist. The only thing that remained was a 2015 Chevy Tahoe sitting on a quiet side street in Waukegan, and a wife who'd never hear from her husband again. 6 years on, every lead has gone cold, over 200 of them chased to dead ends, and the investigators who spent thousands of hours on his case now believe foul play was involved. Barry ran his own criminal defense firm, Barry Bosch's and Associates, out of an office on Grand Avenue in Waukegan. His practice centered on defending people accused of serious crimes in Lake County, the kind of work that puts you in rooms with people most folks would cross the street to avoid. He and his wife Beata split their time between her home in Deerfield and a property in Antioch. By the standards of suburban Lake County, it was an ordinary life, if you overlooked the clientele. And the clientele, as it turned out, was what scared Beata the most. When she reported Barry missing, she told the Lake County Sheriff's deputy that she was frightened specifically because of the people her husband represented. Criminal defense attorneys who take on violent offenders don't just argue cases in court. They visit clients in jail. They learn things that dangerous people might prefer stayed buried, and whether that professional hazard caught up with Barry is a question that remains unanswered. And just on a personal level, having had friends who went into that field, I can fully confirm that many of them got to hear numerous things they wished they didn't ever know. The timeline of March 24th, 2020 is both detailed and maddeningly incomplete. He told his wife he was headed to his Waukegan office and had a client meeting scheduled for later in the day. Around noon, he texted Beata saying he was working on a continuing legal education program at the office. This is the sort of thing that lawyers need to complete a certain amount of hours per year to keep their law license in good standing. She texted back around 2 that afternoon looking for an update on his day, and he replied that he was with a client at the moment. Then there's a gap, and it was a long one. For roughly 9 hours, Barry didn't communicate with his wife at all. Working late isn't unusual for lawyers in general, and it wasn't unusual for Barry either. What was highly unusual is that he generally routinely kept in contact with his wife through text messages throughout the day. When he finally resurfaced via text around 11 that night, he told his wife that he had to travel for work and he was planning to stay there for the night. Aside from the period of silence, this wasn't necessarily unusual, given that criminals don't need representation on a simple 9-to-5 schedule. Roughly an hour later, around midnight, someone made telephone contact with Barry, and that unnamed person was the last individual known to have communicated with him. Beata reported Barry missing the following day on March 25th. The Lake County Sheriff's Office began their investigation and quickly located his Tahoe parked on a side street in Waukegan, about 2 miles from his Grand Avenue law office. Barry wasn't in or around the vehicle, and there was no indication that anything violent had happened in or near that Tahoe. It was as though someone had simply parked the car and walked away, an entirely routine occurrence but for the fact Barry was missing. Within days, the Lake County Sheriff's Office made a public statement that would set the tone for everything that followed. The spokesperson described the disappearance as having unusual characteristics. He revealed that some people Barry contacted before he went missing were potentially troublesome. He also revealed that investigators felt the conversations with those people were potentially concerning, but he didn't elaborate on what that meant. He didn't name the people Barry had spoken to, and he didn't explain what made those conversations alarming. It was clear the sheriff's office already suspected this wasn't a man who'd wandered off for an adventure without telling his wife. Over the months and years that followed, the investigation expanded and then slowly contracted. Detectives with the Lake County Sheriff's Office chased more than 200 individual leads, and they spent thousands of combined man-hours on the case. In September 2020, 6 months after Barry vanished, the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped in to provide technical support. The FBI's involvement suggested the investigation had moved beyond what local resources could handle alone. But even federal support didn't break the case open, and the FBI eventually stepped back, though they reportedly remained available as a resource should the sheriff's office need them again. By the time the 2-year anniversary of Barry's disappearance arrived in early 2022, investigators acknowledged the case had taken many twists and turns, but offered no concrete answers. On the 6th anniversary of his disappearance, the Lake County Sheriff's Office made its position clear and said for the first time publicly that they believe Barry met with foul play. They also said they've exhausted every lead developed over the course of the investigation. That's a striking pair of statements, since law enforcement is confident a crime was committed, but lacks the evidence to charge anyone, let alone secure a conviction. One of the things that really gets me about this case is the timing. March 24th, 2020. The entire world was shutting down, and it was a time when courts were closing and offices were emptying. It was also a time when surveillance cameras were going unmonitored at a record pace, given the shutdowns. It's possible that there was relevant evidence that was caught on camera, but that due to the timing, it was simply never noticed. It's also a time where the news cycle was completely dominated by world events, so Barry's case simply never got the coverage that could have brought more witnesses out of the woodwork. On January 28, 2007, a 63-year-old man sailed a 40-foot ship named Tenacious out of San Francisco Bay. He was alone, heading for the Farallon Islands about 27 miles past the Golden Gate, and he was planning on scattering his mother's ashes at sea. He called his wife, Donna Carnes, from the boat to let her know he was heading beyond cell range, and from there, he faded into history. There were no distress signals and no activation of the boat's emergency position indicating radio beacon, a device designed to trigger automatically if a vessel capsizes or sinks. The Pacific simply swallowed him, his boat, and every trace that either had ever been there. And here's the thing, while he wasn't well known outside his field, Jim was one of the most important people in the history of computer science. In the world of computer science, Jim was as close to intellectual royalty as possible. In 1998, the Association for Computing Machinery awarded him the Turing Award, which is the field's equivalent of a Nobel Prize. He received it for his foundational work on database and transaction processing, the kind of deeply technical research that makes essentially every digital system that handles money function. His career touched nearly every major landmark company in the computing industry, working at IBM, Microsoft, and many other leading companies. If you've ever completed an online purchase without the system crashing halfway through, you've benefited from his work, whether you knew it or not. Gray was reportedly a deeply engaged person, generous with his time and known for mentoring younger researchers. By all accounts, he was a happy, fulfilled individual, and on top of that, he'd recently become a grandfather. His daughter later said he was the most content she'd ever seen him in the period before his disappearance. There was no note, no indication of personal distress, no reason at all to believe he wanted to be anywhere other than back at the dock by evening. The Coast Guard launched its standard operation, and planes, helicopters, and boats swept the waters off San Francisco for 4 days. They eventually covered roughly 132,000 square miles of ocean, but didn't find a single thing. When the official search was suspended, the technology community refused to accept it. What followed was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary civilian search efforts ever organized. Engineers from companies that were normally bitter competitors dropped what they were doing. People from Microsoft, Google, Oracle, and Amazon worked side by side. Digital Globe, the company that provides satellite imagery for Google Maps and Google Earth, volunteered one of its satellites to photograph the search area from orbit. NASA diverted an ER-2 aircraft, the civilian variant of the U-2 spy plane, to capture high-altitude imagery of the ocean surface. Friends and colleagues chartered private planes and flew over the water themselves, scanning with binoculars and cameras. Then came the part that nobody had ever tried before. Engineers at Amazon took the satellite and aerial images, sliced them into hundreds of thousands of small tiles, each showing a 300 by 300 meter patch of ocean. They then uploaded them to Amazon Mechanical Turk, a platform where users complete small digital tasks. Within days, roughly 12,000 volunteers from around the world had joined what became known as the Jim Gray Group. Together, they worked through more than 560,000 individual images, scanning each one for any sign of a red-hulled sailboat. It was one of the first large-scale applications of crowdsourcing for a search and rescue operation. And the cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The systems underpinning this effort, the databases, the distributed computing, the large-scale data processing, were technologies Jim Gray had spent his life advancing. The prevailing theory among marine experts is straightforward and grim. Gray's boat was a design that's reportedly vulnerable to hull damage, and the waters near the Farallon Islands are full of drifting debris. A collision with a submerged object could have punched a hole in the hull, and a boat like his could take on water and sink in as little as 30 seconds. If Gray was below deck when it happened, he wouldn't have had time to send a distress call or grab safety equipment. The emergency transponder, which should activate on contact with water, may have been damaged or destroyed before it could transmit. Other theories have surfaced over the years, and some have speculated that Gray chose to disappear, sailing off to start a new life somewhere. But this doesn't hold up under any scrutiny. He was wealthy, successful, happily married, and had a new grandchild. His colleagues described him as enthusiastic about ongoing research projects, and while he had the means, there was simply no motive. Some people have also floated the idea of foul play, perhaps connected to his technical knowledge, but there's no evidence to support this. It's entirely possible that this did occur, but as I said, there's simply no evidence whatsoever to suggest that this is what happened. On January 28, 2012, exactly 5 years after he sailed out of San Francisco Bay, a court granted his wife's petition to have Jim Gray declared legally dead. The 5-year waiting period is standard in California for missing persons when no body has been recovered. It was a legal formality, but it also represented something grimmer, the final acknowledgement that he wasn't coming back. The thing that sticks with me about this case is that the greatest concentration of technical talent on the planet tried to find one man on the ocean, and they couldn't do it. They had satellites, literal spy planes, sonar, a massive degree of crowdsourcing, unlimited funding, and the collective will of an entire industry. Despite all that, the Pacific Ocean is simply too vast, and it's continued to guard the secret of what happened to this pioneering computer scientist. Shergar, arguably the most famous racehorse on the planet, vanished from his stable in rural Ireland in the middle of the night. The full truth of what happened to him has never been established beyond the claims of a handful of informants and anonymous sources whose accounts don't always line up. It remains one of the strangest unsolved crimes of the 20th century, a case where the victim couldn't speak and where the police only arrived when the horse was literally out of the barn. In June 1981, the 3-year-old colt lined up for the Epsom Derby under a 19-year-old jockey named Walter Swinburne. Shergar won by 10 lengths, the largest winning margin in the race's history going back over 200 years. Over the weeks that followed, Shergar went on to win the Irish Derby by 4 lengths, and then the King George VI and Queen Elizabeth Stakes by another 4. He was, without any serious argument, the most dominant racehorse of his generation, and everyone in the racing world knew it. His owner, the Aga Khan, retired him to stud at the end of that year and syndicated him for £10 million across 40 shares at £250,000 each. There'd been an offer from American breeders reportedly worth around $40 million, but the Aga Khan turned it down, preferring to keep the horse in Ireland. Shergar took up residence at Ballymenny Ranch in County Kildare, where, in theory, he'd generate tens of millions in breeding fees over the course of his lifetime. On the evening of February 8, 1983, 3 armed men wearing balaclavas arrived at the home of Jim Fitzgerald, the head groom at Ballymenny. His family were locked into a room in the house while the men told him, plainly, that they'd come for Shergar. Fitzgerald was marched to the stallion's stable at gunpoint and forced to load the horse into a waiting horse trailer. And as an aside, in researching this case, I learned that horse trailers are called horse boxes on the other side of the pond, and I will now forever be calling them horse boxes. From there, the gang drove Fitzgerald around for roughly 4 hours before releasing him near a small village about 20 miles from the ranch. He made his way to a local police station, but by then the horse and the horse box had dissolved into the Irish countryside. It would be roughly 8 hours from the moment of the theft before the Gardaí, Ireland's national police, were fully alerted and operational on the case. The gang demanded a ransom of £2 million, and negotiations reportedly took place over the following days, but the syndicate members couldn't agree on how to respond. 34 different shareholders, spread across multiple countries, had to somehow coordinate a position on whether to pay. They also couldn't verify that the people contacting them actually had the horse, and they couldn't agree on who had the authority to make decisions for the syndicate. The thieves, for their part, grew frustrated with the lack of progress, and after roughly 4 days, communication stopped entirely. Importantly, no proof of life was sent during this period, and it wasn't even confirmed that Shergar was still in Ireland at the time. The police effort that followed was plagued with problems from the start. The theft happened to coincide with one of Ireland's major horse auction events. That meant the roads of Kildare and surrounding counties were packed with horse boxes that night. The horse box carrying Shergar vanished into a flood of identical-looking vehicles, and by the time anyone was looking for it, it could have been anywhere on the island. There were also jurisdictional tensions that made things even worse, with 2 police forces allegedly engaging in glory-seeking behavior rather than cooperation. The Dublin-based Gardaí and the Kildare-based Gardaí were both on the case, but, by various accounts, weren't sharing information effectively with one another. The investigation attracted enormous international media attention, which the police were utterly unprepared for. The scrutiny was intense and the tips were overwhelming, but the actual leads were few. There was a sting attempt in July of 1983, when a veterinarian who'd been Shergar's vet assisted the Gardaí in an operation that involved placing ransom money in a remote village. Their plan was to dump a large sum of cash into the trunk of a car, with the horse nappers coming to retrieve the cash and dropping off the horse. As it turned out, the money was stolen from the car overnight, and the supposed kidnappers never materialized. The detective involved was later dismissed from the force for breaching regulations, with some unproven allegations made about the whole thing being an inside job to steal the money. The full affair was an embarrassment, and it brought the investigation no closer to finding the missing horse. Years later, a revelation surfaced. The Gardaí had reportedly been warned months in advance that a plan was in motion to steal a valuable racehorse for ransom. A trusted informant had provided specific details about the plot and even named some of the people involved. Over the years, a picture has emerged through informants and investigative journalism that points heavily toward a certain well-known Irish group as the perpetrators. The most prominent account came from Sean O'Callaghan, a former IRA member who became an informant for the Irish government. In his 1999 autobiography, O'Callaghan laid out his version of events. He claimed the operation had been masterminded by Kevin Mallon, a senior figure in the organization who reportedly conceived the plan while serving time in prison. The logic, according to O'Callaghan, was extremely straightforward. Kidnapping a horse for ransom would generate funding without provoking the same public backlash that kidnapping a person would. The organization needed money to fund their operations, and Shergar was quite literally worth more than his weight in gold. At the end of the day, so the logic went, a few extremely wealthy people would fork over their share of the $2 million, and the horse would be back in his stable safe and sound. What reportedly went wrong was the horse himself, since Shergar was a high-strung thoroughbred stallion, not a cooperative hostage. According to O'Callaghan's account, the horse panicked after being moved and injured his leg. The gang had no veterinary expertise and no way to manage a distressed animal of that size and temperament. When the ransom negotiations collapsed, Mallon reportedly concluded that releasing the horse was too risky because of the surveillance he believed he was under. Mallon allegedly ordered Shergar to be eliminated approximately 4 days after the kidnapping, after it became clear his condition wasn't getting better. Notably, though, there's a number of reasons to doubt O'Callaghan's claim, the primary one being that he brought absolutely no evidence to the table to verify it. He also didn't claim to be involved in the horse heist directly, and claimed to only know about it from the people who were involved. He also gave varied different accounts of the story over the years, and attempted to use the story to sell a book. There's also a speculative theory that he may have been hired to put up a smokescreen for the true kidnappers. The story of a super horse on Irish soil being horse heisted by one of the most famous groups in the world seemed a bit too perfect for some observers. Some theorized that the horse had been stolen by a group that intended to use him to breed racehorses. However, this idea is inherently problematic, given that the lineage of every major racehorse is well known, which would cause issues of parentage for the offspring. The legendary remains of this stolen horse have never been found, but there's been speculation over the years about burial sites across Ireland. No forensic evidence has ever surfaced, and the case of Shergar remains officially open and unsolved. She bought a few packets of rat poison from the local store, smiling politely, explaining she had a problem with mice. She signed the poison register as required by law, her own name in her own handwriting, and walked home to Turner Lane in Ashton-under-Lyne. She had enough strychnine and arsenic to wipe out an entire colony of rodents, but here's the thing, there were never really any rodents. Within 3 months, 3 people would perish, and Mary Ann would have her ticket for a state-sponsored appointment with the Grim Reaper himself. Mary Ann Britland was born Mary Ann Haig in 1847, and her early years looked like those of thousands of other working-class women in industrial Lancashire. By the time she was 14, she was already working full-time as a laborer in a cotton mill. She married Thomas Britland, a cart driver who also worked as a bartender at the Heaps Vaults on Old Street. Together they had children and settled into a rented house at 133 Turner Lane. Mary Ann held 2 jobs herself, working the factory floor during the day and pulling pints as a barmaid at night. It was an unremarkable existence in a town built on cotton and coal, where people worked long hours and didn't expect much beyond survival. Nobody on Turner Lane in 1885 had any reason to suspect that one of their neighbors was about to become a serial poisoner. At some point in late 1885 or early 1886, Mary Ann began an affair with her neighbor, Thomas Dixon. The Dixons lived just across the street from the Britland house on Turner Lane. Thomas Dixon's wife, Mary, was 29 years old and reportedly had no idea what was going on between her husband and the woman who lived a few doors down. The affair wasn't just a fling for Mary Ann. She wanted Thomas Dixon permanently. She wanted to marry him, and she was apparently willing to clear every obstacle in her path to make that happen. The first obstacle, strangely enough, wasn't her husband, but her own daughter. Mary Ann reportedly believed that 19-year-old Elizabeth suspected her mother's affair with Dixon and might expose it. Whether Elizabeth actually knew anything or whether this was paranoia on Mary Ann's part, we don't know. But in Mary Ann's mind, her eldest daughter had become a threat to the new life she was building, and that was enough. Sometime in early March 1886, Elizabeth Hannah Britland fell violently ill. A doctor was called, but he attributed Elizabeth's illness and eventual passing to natural causes. Mary Ann promptly collected 10 pounds on Elizabeth's life insurance policy, and Elizabeth was buried shortly after, with nobody suspecting foul play. With Elizabeth gone, Mary Ann turned her attention to the next obstacle, her husband. Thomas Britland, 44 years old, died on the 3rd of May, 1886, and the attending doctor diagnosed epilepsy as the cause of death. Once again, the symptoms had been violent and sudden, but Victorian medicine wasn't always precise. As usual, Mary Ann collected on another insurance policy, suggesting a strong secondary motive for these disturbing acts. After Thomas Britland's death, Mary Ann and her surviving daughter were invited to stay with the Dixons at 128 Turner Lane. It was a gesture of kindness from Mary Dixon, who apparently felt sympathy for her newly widowed neighbor. Mary Ann was now living under the same roof as Thomas Dixon, which was exactly where she wanted to be, but there was still one person in the way. On the 14th of May, 1886, Mary Dixon became violently ill and passed away the same day, but this time, somebody noticed. The suspicious circumstances surrounding Mary Dixon's death prompted local authorities to act. A post-mortem examination was conducted the following day, and the results were damning. Medical examiners found lethal quantities of both strychnine and arsenic in Mary Dixon's stomach and tissues. The police began investigating immediately, and they didn't have to look far. Authorities ordered the exhumation of Elizabeth Britland's body and Thomas Britland's body. Both were exhumed on the 16th of June, 1886, and chemical analysis confirmed poisoning in both cases. Mary Ann Britland was arrested, and so was Thomas Dixon, initially on suspicion that he'd been involved in his own wife's poisoning. But the investigation eventually cleared Dixon of any role in the poisonings, despite his involvement in the affair. Mary Ann Britland stood trial on the 22nd of July, 1886 at Manchester Assizes. Although all 3 deaths were presented as evidence, the actual charge tried was the poisoning of Mary Dixon. Elizabeth and Thomas Britland were introduced to demonstrate a pattern of behavior and to counter any defense claim that the poisoning could have been accidental. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. A physician presented his findings on the presence of poison in all 3 victims' bodies. The poison register, which she had to sign to make these purchases, showed Mary Ann's purchases in her own handwriting in advance of each poisoning. There was no evidence of any mice in any of the properties she'd lived in, which demolished her stated reason for buying the poison in the first place. And the motive was clear. She'd been having an affair with Thomas Dixon and wanted to remove everyone standing between her and the life she imagined with him. The defense, for their part, simply said that Mary Ann had no motive for doing what she did, which strikes me as something of a Hail Mary pass. Despite the clear and obvious nature of the evidence, the jury ended up deliberating well into the night, an unusual outcome for the time, before ultimately coming back with a guilty verdict. Mary Ann responded by telling the court they had got it all wrong, but she would change her tune shortly after and confess everything to her mother and her surviving daughter. On the morning of August 9th, just weeks after her conviction, Britland faced her appointment with the gallows. The Britland case raises uncomfortable questions about how deaths were certified in the late 19th century. Two doctors attributed violent, sudden deaths to natural causes and epilepsy without performing autopsies or toxicology tests. The third death only triggered scrutiny because the pattern had become impossible to ignore. If Mary Ann had stopped after two victims, she might never have been caught, and it was her own compulsive repetition that brought the whole thing down. It makes me question how many so-called natural deaths of the era may have been misattributed, rather than something much more sinister. In December 2013, in a world where almost nobody uses payphones anymore, a 37-year-old married man drove to a Kangaroo gas station on Joe White Avenue in Myrtle Beach. He stepped out of his truck and called a 20-year-old woman from a payphone at 1:35 in the morning. Within 3 hours of that call, the young woman on the other end would disappear without a trace. This is the story of Heather Elvis, and this is a case that, more than a decade later, still hasn't given up its most important secret. Heather Elvis was born on June 30th, 1993, and grew up in the Carolina Forest area of Horry County, South Carolina, not far from the tourist sprawl of Myrtle Beach. By the fall of 2013, she was 20 years old, studying cosmetology and working 2 jobs to pay her way. She was a hostess at the Tilted Kilt, a bar and restaurant chain in Myrtle Beach, and also picked up shifts at the House of Blues in North Myrtle Beach. People who knew her described her as outgoing, warm, and trusting, perhaps to a fault. Sometime around June or July of 2013, Heather started a relationship with a man named Sidney Moorer. He was 37, married with children, and he'd been doing kitchen equipment repairs at the Tilted Kilt. Heather was young, and Sidney reportedly presented himself as something other than what he was. The affair continued through the summer and into the fall, lasting roughly 4 months before Sidney's wife, Tammy Moorer, discovered what was going on. That discovery and what Tammy did about it is where this story turns extremely dark. When Tammy Moorer found out about the affair in early November 2013, she didn't quietly cope and seethe. According to testimony later presented in court, Tammy called the Tilted Kilt repeatedly, trying to get Heather fired. She threatened that Sidney would stop repairing their equipment as long as Heather worked there. She called Heather directly, sometimes for hours on end, and she reportedly sent Heather explicit photos and videos of herself and Sidney together. On November 1st, 2013, Tammy sent Heather a message that would later become a central piece of evidence. The message threatened violence in graphic terms, warning Heather she was about to take her last breath. Heather's roommate later told the court that Heather was scared of Tammy and that the affair was over by that point. Sidney and Heather had stopped seeing each other, but Tammy wasn't finished. The harassment continued through November and into December. a sustained campaign against a young woman who, for all practical purposes, had already walked away from the situation. On the evening of December 17th, Heather went out on a first date with a different man, someone she'd known from high school. At one point during the evening, Heather texted her father a photo of herself driving her date's stick-shift car, a perfectly normal moment suggesting nothing was amiss. Her date dropped her off at her apartment around 1:15 on December 18th, and here's where it gets complicated. At 1:12 on December 18th, slightly before Heather even got home, surveillance footage from a Myrtle Beach Walmart captured Sidney entering the store. He purchased cigars and a pregnancy test, then left after about 7 minutes, and the pregnancy test would become a point of contention during trial proceedings. Prosecutors suggested it wasn't for his wife, but for Heather. 23 minutes later, at 1:35 a.m., a surveillance camera at the Kangaroo gas station on Joe White Avenue recorded Sidney making a call from the payphone across the street. Phone records confirmed the call went to Heather's cell, a call lasting just 3 minutes. After it ended, Heather called Sidney back 9 times within the next 35 minutes. What was said during those calls? Nobody outside the two of them knows. But whatever it was, it pulled Heather out of her apartment and toward Peachtree Landing, a boat ramp on the Waccamaw River in Socastee, about 8 miles from where she lived. Phone records and surveillance footage pieced together a grim sequence. Around 3:37 a.m., Heather's phone arrived at Peachtree Landing, and starting at 3:38, 3 calls were placed from her phone to Sidney's cell, all unanswered, within the space of 2 minutes. At 3:41, another call went through, and this one connected. Meanwhile, private security cameras along the roughly 3-mile stretch between the Moorers' home and Peachtree Landing captured a dark Ford F-150 heading towards there. 2 data points were gathered from the surveillance camera, with the last being at 3:39. At 3:45, the same vehicle was recorded heading back in the opposite direction. The FBI and the South Carolina Highway Patrol's Accident Investigation Unit later analyzed and enhanced the footage, and they determined the truck belonged to Sidney Moorer. A minute and a half after that final call at 3:41, all data records for Heather's phone went dead. Her last recorded location placed her somewhere in the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge, and she hasn't been heard from since. That's a 6-minute window. The truck arrives heading toward the landing around 3:39, and it's heading back home by 3:45. On the evening of December 19th, a patrol officer discovered Heather's green 2001 Dodge Intrepid parked at the Peachtree Landing boat ramp. The car was locked and it was parked perpendicular to the marked spaces, as if it had been left in a hurry or by someone unfamiliar with the lot. When officers opened it, there was no purse, no phone, no keys, and no sign of Heather. Terry Elvis reported his daughter missing, and the full search began on December 20th. Dive teams, helicopters, and boats combed the Waccamaw River and the local bay, and sniffer dogs were also extensively employed in the operation. To this day, despite extensive searches of the surrounding area and the wildlife refuge, Heather's body has never been recovered. Despite everything, there was no forensic evidence whatsoever of what specifically happened to her, or any direct evidence that a crime even occurred. When investigators sat Sidney Moorer down to talk, he initially denied calling Heather on the night she disappeared. He maintained that denial right up until a detective told him they had surveillance footage of someone using the payphone. Only then did Sidney change his story, and he claimed he'd called Heather to tell her to leave him alone, saying she'd been putting notes on his car at work. Given that the affair had ended weeks earlier, and that it was Tammy, not Heather, who'd been doing the ongoing harassing, this explanation struck investigators as thin. Both Sidney and Tammy Moorer were arrested in 2014 and charged with a variety of offenses, including the slaying of Heather. But the most serious charges were eventually dropped in 2016 because, without a body, proving the crime beyond a reasonable doubt was a steep climb. In the end, the charges that remained against the couple were related to the kidnapping of Heather Elvis and nothing more. Tammy Moorer went to trial first, and in October 2018, she was convicted of kidnapping Heather and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sidney's first trial ended in a hung jury, but he was retried in September 2019 and found guilty. He also received a 30-year sentence for kidnapping and was separately convicted of obstruction of justice, carrying an additional 10-year term. Both appealed their convictions, but in June 2023, the South Carolina Court of Appeals upheld the convictions, finding sufficient evidence to support the jury's verdicts. The convictions brought some justice, but they didn't answer the question that hangs over this entire case. Without a body, without a confession, and without any physical evidence tying the Moorers to a specific act of violence, the details of her final moments remain unknown. The prosecution argued she was lured to Peachtree Landing and taken against her will, but what exactly the Moorers did and where they took her remains a blank spot in the record. The Waccamaw River runs dark and slow, and the wildlife refuge covers thousands of acres of swamp and bottomland forest. It's the kind of terrain that swallows bodies whole and doesn't give them back easily. But despite that, Heather's family believes the truth will one day come to light. The daughter of Italy's most famous couple vanished in New Orleans. 30 years later, her parents still can't agree on whether she's dead. Elenia Carisi was born on November 29, 1970, in Rome, to a family that was the equivalent of celebrity royalty on both sides of the Atlantic. Her parents were Albano Carisi and Romina Power, one of Italy's most beloved musical duos, often compared to Sonny and Cher. Her maternal grandfather was Tyrone Power, the Hollywood actor who'd ruled the box office in the 1940s. Her maternal grandmother, Linda Christian, originally from Mexico, was also an actress who had found some degree of stardom in Hollywood. Elenia grew up in the kind of family where everyone in the country knew her name, but she yearned for a life outside the spotlight. She appeared alongside her parents in a 1984 film and briefly served as the Vanna White equivalent on Italy's version of Wheel of Fortune in 1989. But the spotlight wasn't for her. Elenia was bookish, a scholarly young woman who was serious about writing and literature. She enrolled at King's College London to study literature and reportedly earned the highest marks in her class. During her studies, Elenia began dreaming of something bigger than a degree. She wanted to travel the world with a backpack and a journal, collecting material for the book she planned to write. She returned to Italy, sold her belongings to fund the trip, and set off solo through Central and South America. She spent time in Belize, painting, taking notes, and falling in with the kind of people who don't show up in society columns. They were street musicians, drifters, and people who were trying to get away from the world. In short, they were the transient population of small tropical coastal towns. It was during this period that she first visited New Orleans and met the man who some claim is at the center of everything that came next. His name was Alexander Masekela, and he was a 54-year-old street musician, more than twice Elenia's age. By multiple accounts, he was an unsettling figure. He had a reputation in the French Quarter as a self-styled guru who participated in some seriously questionable activities. There were rumors of substance use, accusations of the most disturbing forms of violence in his past, and a persona that mixed street corner mysticism with personal magnetism. Yet despite all the red flags, Elenia was captivated, and she reportedly referred to Masekela as her master. Her mother grew alarmed, expressing concern about Masekela's influence, But Elenia was now 23 and very stubborn about doing things her own way. After months traveling through Belize and Mexico, Elenia headed back to New Orleans in late December 1993. Her brother Yari flew to Belize to find her, arriving in the village of Hopkins on December 27th, only to learn she'd boarded a bus for Louisiana the day before. By New Year's Eve, Elenia had checked into the Leedale Hotel on St. Charles Avenue, sharing a room with Masakila. Her parents spoke with her by phone on New Year's Day. It was the last time they'd hear her voice. According to the hotel, Elenia left around noon on January 6, 1994, and never came back. She didn't take her passport. She didn't take her backpack, her camera, her notebooks, or her clothing. Everything she'd carried across 2 continents stayed behind in that hotel room. Elenia was effectively alone, and nobody raised an alarm. She was completely isolated from everyone who cared about her. Meanwhile, Masakela stayed at the hotel until January 14th, and reportedly tried to use traveler's checks made out to Elenia to cover the bill. Her parents didn't report her missing until January 18th, 12 days after she'd last been seen. Then, on January 30th, a security guard came forward with a story that would define the case for the next 3 decades. The guard's name was Albert Cordova, and he worked at the Audubon Aquarium of the Americas. He told investigators that on the night of January 6th, around 11:30 p.m., he'd been patrolling Woldenberg Park along the Mississippi. He spotted a blonde woman sitting alone on the pier, looking dejected and defeated. When he told her she couldn't be there after hours, she reportedly said something to the effect that it didn't matter, that she belonged to the water. She jumped into the river and swam toward the center, making it roughly 100 yards before she started struggling. A passing boat's wake hit her and she went under, but he didn't see her come back up. Cordova called it in, and boats and a police helicopter searched for hours and found nothing. No body was recovered that night, and none of the remains pulled from the Mississippi in the following months were ever identified as Elenia. Here's the thing about this account. Cordova tentatively identified photos of Elenia as the woman he'd seen, but a tentative identification isn't a confirmed one. The physical description was similar but not identical, though this may be because Elenia no longer cared about her appearance. Add to this the fact that the Mississippi is one of the most powerful waterways on the continent. A body entering that current at night could be swept into the Gulf of Mexico rapidly, and there would likely simply be nothing left to find. It was never confirmed that this woman was Elenia, and notably he didn't recall her speaking with a noticeable accent of any kind. Masakela was arrested on January 31st, 1994, but not in connection with Elenia's disappearance. An ex-girlfriend accused him of assault, but he was released after less than 2 weeks due to insufficient evidence. No charges related to Elenia were ever filed against him, and investigators couldn't tie him to whatever happened to her. Elenia's disappearance didn't just end her story. It effectively ended her parents' marriage. Albano and Romina separated in 1999 and finalized their divorce in 2012. The central dispute was the thing they couldn't agree on, whether their daughter was alive or not. Albano came around slowly, and for years he held out hope, but in November 2006, he publicly stated for the first time that he believed Albert Cordova's account. He accepted, as best he could, that his daughter had gone into the Mississippi River that night and hadn't come out. In January 2013, he filed a legal petition to have Elenia declared presumed dead, and the Italian courts granted the request in December 2014, 20 years after she'd vanished. Romina, for her part, never accepted it, and she's spoken publicly about her belief that Elenia is still alive. She claimed that as a mother, she carries an invisible connection with her daughter, and if Elenia had died, she would have felt it. Over the decades, Scattered alleged sightings across the United States and Europe have surfaced, but none have been confirmed. In 2008, a German magazine reported Alenia was living in a cult-like environment in Arizona, though Albano dismissed the claim. There are essentially three possibilities of what happened, and none of them are fully satisfying by any stretch of the imagination. The first is that Cordova's account is accurate, and the woman he watched enter the Mississippi on that fateful January night was Alenia. If so, her remains were likely carried to the Gulf, and there will never be a recovery. This is the explanation her father accepted and the Italian courts adopted. It rests on a tentative identification and a single witness, but it's the simplest reading of what evidence exists. The second possibility is that something happened to Alenia involving Masekela. His behavior after her disappearance, his history, and the power dynamic in their relationship all raise serious questions. However, it's important to remember that questions aren't evidence, and no prosecutor ever found enough to bring charges. There's essentially no evidence to suggest that he was involved other than the fact that he was generally a suspicious character, and he was one of the last people seen with her. The third is the one Romina Power clings to, that Alenia walked away deliberately and is living somewhere under a different name. She'd already shown a willingness to shed her old identity and vanish into unfamiliar places. That said, walking away without a passport, without money, without a single possession, is a different thing entirely. It's the theory that requires the most faith and has the least evidence by far, but it could indeed be true. There's also the potential that none of these situations actually describe what happened to her, since there's very little in the way of actual confirmed evidence. It's entirely possible that she met up with someone else dangerous somewhere in the United States and met her end somewhere else entirely. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to consider checking out the membership or the Patreon if you feel like taking your support for my show to the next level. Imagine a man who robs a train, rides back into town before dawn, and slips through the window of a saloon. All the while, he had one of his crew telling the regulars that the constable was deep in a poker game and didn't want to be disturbed. That outlaw was the constable himself, a man named Bert Alvord, and in the final years of the 19th century, he pulled off one of the most audacious double lives on the American frontier. When the law finally caught up with him, he vanished so thoroughly that nobody can say for certain where or when he died. Bert Alvord was born in September 1867 in Plumas County, California. His father, Charles, was a prospector and mechanic who chased mining work across the West. He dragged the family to Tombstone, Arizona around 1880, not long before the Earps and the Clantons shot it out near the OK Corral. Young Bert took any work he could get his hands on and grew up surrounded by a mixture of cowboys, outlaws, gamblers, and lawmen. In 1886, Cochise County Sheriff John Horton Slaughter, one of the toughest lawmen in the territory, recruited Alvord as a deputy. Slaughter reportedly called him fearless, and for 3 years, Bert helped track down rustlers and outlaws across southeastern Arizona, earning a reputation as a capable enforcer. He also developed a serious drinking problem during this time, and when Slaughter confronted him about it, Bert quit cold turkey. And I'm not talking about putting down the bottle by any means. I mean, he quit working for the Cochise County Sheriff. He drifted through a string of smaller law enforcement jobs during the 1890s, working in Fairbank and Pierce before landing the position of constable in Wilcox around 1897. He married Lola Ochoa, bought a ranch, and seemed to settle down into something approaching a normal Old West lifestyle. His father died in 1898, and something shifted after that. Whatever it was, Bert Alvord started thinking a lot about trains. On the night of September 9th, 1899, a westbound Southern Pacific Express pulled into the small station at Cochise, Arizona. Armed men confronted the express messenger, lined up the crew at gunpoint, detached the express car, and ran it a couple of miles down the track. They then blew the safe with dynamite. The take was reportedly somewhere between $10,000 and $30,000 in gold, a fairly huge sum at the time, though the exact figure has never been settled. When the news reached Wilcox, Constable Bert Alvord was among the loudest voices calling for a manhunt. He'd been in Schwertner's saloon all evening, after all, playing poker with his friends Billy Stiles, Matt Burtz, and Bill Downing. The bartender could confirm it. The drinks had been flowing all night, and he delivered them right outside the door so as not to interrupt this intense, high-stakes game. There was just one problem with this alibi. The poker game was a fiction. Bert and his gang had slipped out a side window, ridden to Cochise Station, robbed the train, and ridden back before anyone in the saloon's front room noticed a thing. The constable had organized the robbery, set up the cover story, and then joined the posse looking for himself and his crew. It was brazen, and it worked, and for months, with nobody suspecting that Bert could possibly be involved. Emboldened, Bert planned a second job, and on February 15, 1900, members of his gang hit another Southern Pacific train at Fairbank. This time, things went wrong. The express messenger on duty was Jeff Milton, a former Texas Ranger working as a substitute that night. When the robbers ordered him to put his hands up, Milton said no way and grabbed a sawed-off shotgun. He took a bullet in the left shoulder but still managed to fire back, severely injuring one of the men. The robbers fled with their wounded man and, according to legend, a grand haul of a total of 17 crisp Mexican pesos. The injured robber, a man named Dunlop, was left 6 miles from Tombstone and eventually perished in a hospital there. Before he went, though, he decided it was time to sing like a canary, and sing he did. He told investigators that Bert Alvord, the constable of Wilcox, had organized the whole operation, both the Fairbank job and the Cochise robbery. Alvord was arrested and held at the Cochise County Jail in Tombstone, and that should have been the end of it. Instead, on April 7th, 1900, Billy Stiles, a fellow gang member, walked into the jail, held up a deputy, and demanded the release of every prisoner in the building. When the deputy hesitated, Stiles shot him in the foot, blowing off 2 of his toes. Ironically, this put a certain haste in the deputy's step, and he proceeded to free all the prisoners, including Bert himself. For the next several years, Alvord and Stiles lived as fugitives along the Mexican border. In 1902, Alvord cut a deal with the Arizona Rangers to help capture the notorious bandit Augustin Chacon in exchange for reward money and a reduced sentence. When the outlaw was caught, old Bert decided that he'd just take the reward money and pass up on the surrendering element. Bert was recaptured in December 1903 but escaped again almost immediately. Then came the strangest chapter. Bert attempted to fake his own death and that of Stiles by sending the bodies of 2 unidentified Mexican men to Tombstone. His friend claimed they were the bodies of the 2 wanted outlaws, but authorities opened the coffins, took one look at the decomposing remains, and knew it wasn't them. Disturbingly, it's believed that the 2 outlaws may have eliminated 2 innocent men. The Arizona Rangers finally ran Alvord and Stiles to ground near Naco on the Mexican border in February 1904. When the 2 men went for their weapons, the Rangers opened fire. Alvord was hit twice in the leg. Stiles caught a round in the arm but somehow managed to escape yet again. Alvord, wounded and unable to run, surrendered. He was sentenced to 2 years in the Yuma Territorial Prison, a brutal facility where summer temperatures inside the stone cells could exceed 100 degrees. Alvord served his time without incident, and when he walked out of Yuma around late 1905, he was 38 years old. He was a former lawman with a criminal record that stretched across the territory. According to old-timers in Wilcox, he stopped back in town briefly to say hello to friends before he announced he was leaving for Central America by ship. And that's where the story fractures. After 1905, Bert Alvord effectively ceased to exist as a verifiable person. There are stories, but they don't agree with one another. One account has him working as a laborer on a railroad construction project along the Amazon River in Brazil. According to this version, he contracted yellow fever and was sent to the island of Barbados, where he reportedly died. On July 24, 1910, a local Arizona newspaper ran a short item claiming, based on information from an alleged friend, that Alvord had recently died of fever. This appears to have been based entirely on the rumor that he perished in Barbados, rather than an independent story, with no corroborating evidence whatsoever. Another version puts him in Panama, working as an employee on the canal construction project, which at the time attracted thousands of laborers from across the Americas. He was reportedly spotted there around 1910, but again, the sourcing on this is thin. A third story, which was popular among old-timers around Wilcox, holds that Alvord used his share of the hidden robbery loot to buy a cattle ranch somewhere in Central America. Under this version of events, he lived out the rest of his days under an assumed name. If this was true, the lawman turned outlaw reverted to the ranching life he'd briefly tried in Arizona, just in a country where nobody knew his name. That, of course, brings us to the question of what happened to the gold from that first successful train heist. The loot from the Cochise station robbery was reportedly buried along the old trail between Wilcox and Cochise, near a cabin about half a mile outside town. Bert and his gang had agreed to retrieve it once things cooled down, but arrests and escapes kept getting in the way. Wells Fargo agents searched the area thoroughly and came up empty. The gold has never been recovered, and some believe Alvord dug it up after Yuma, using it to fund his new life abroad. Whether Bert Alvord died of fever on a Caribbean island, worked himself to death on the Panama Canal, or grew old on a Central American ranch is something we'll likely never know. His story doesn't end with a final showdown or a hanging or even a confirmed grave. It ends with a man walking out of prison, saying goodbye to old friends, boarding a ship, and sailing into a void that has lasted over a century. A maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis sat in the parking lot of the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, its doors unlocked, its owner nowhere to be found. It was the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, and the most powerful Union leader in American history had just walked off the face of the earth. Jimmy Hoffa was 62 years old, 5'5", and built like a compressed spring with a personality to match. On that Wednesday afternoon, whatever luck or cunning had kept him alive through decades of mob deals, federal investigations, and prison finally ran out. 50 years later, we still don't know exactly what happened in the hours after he climbed into that Mercury. But we know enough to piece together why it happened, and who almost certainly made the call. Jimmy Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in Brazil, Indiana, a small economically downtrodden coal mining town where nobody had the time to focus on much other than survival. His father, a coal drill operator, died when Jimmy was 7, and the family relocated to Detroit shortly after. By 14, Hoffa had dropped out of school to work, as was the style at the time for someone of his socio-economic background. He unloaded freight cars at a Kroger warehouse for 32 cents an hour, and it was there, on a sweltering loading dock, that his education in organized labor truly began. While still a teenager, Hoffa organized his first strike, legitimately fighting for the rights of working people. Workers at the Kroger warehouse refused to unload a massive shipment of strawberries until management agreed to better conditions. Hoffa timed the action perfectly, so that a significant amount of these perishable goods would rot if the bosses didn't cave. They caved, and it taught Hoffa something he'd carry for the rest of his life. Leverage is everything, and timing is how you use it. He joined the Teamsters in 1933 and rose fast. By 1936, he was effectively running Local 299 in Detroit. By 1942, he'd organized the Michigan Conference of Teamsters and began centralizing bargaining power across the state. In 1952, he became the union's national vice president, and by 1957, he'd become its general president. Under Hoffa, the Teamsters became the largest single union in the United States, with membership eventually surpassing 2 million. In 1964, he negotiated the National Master Freight Agreement, the first nationwide contract for trucking industry workers. For the rank and file, Hoffa was a hero. He got them better wages, better benefits, and he fought like hell to do it. But the methods he used to build that power were exactly the thing that would destroy him. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, established in 1955 under Hoffa's direction, was supposed to secure retirement income for working truck drivers. In practice, it became a private bank for organized crime, with Hoffa himself enriching himself substantially off these deals. The fund eventually swelled to over $2 billion, and Hoffa treated it less like a fiduciary responsibility and more like a tool for building alliances. Low-interest loans flowed freely to mob-connected developers in Las Vegas and Southern California. Between 1958 and 1977, nearly $250 million in pension fund money was loaned to casino operators with ties to organized crime families. Kickbacks, usually 10% of the loan amount disguised as finder's fees, cycled back through intermediaries. The pension fund effectively financed the construction of Las Vegas as we know it today. This made Hoffa indispensable to the mob, but also a target for law enforcement. Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General, pursued Hoffa with something bordering on obsession. The two men despised each other, and their feud became intensely personal on both sides. Kennedy's investigations laid bare the corruption of the Teamsters' leadership, and after years of failed prosecutions, the government finally got Hoffa in 1964. He was convicted of jury tampering in Chattanooga, Tennessee, based largely on the testimony of a Teamsters insider who, figuratively speaking, knew where all the bodies were buried. 4 months later, a separate trial in Chicago produced convictions on fraud charges related to the pension fund. The combined sentences totaled 13 years, and Hoffa entered Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania on March 7, 1967. Hoffa served less than 5 years, and on December 23, 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence to time served. It wasn't a pardon, and it came with a condition that would become the central grievance of Hoffa's remaining years. He was barred from engaging in any direct or indirect management of a labor organization until at least March of 1980. Hoffa always insisted he'd never agreed to that restriction, and he filed a lawsuit to have it overturned. The court sided with Nixon. The restriction stood. But Hoffa wasn't the kind of man who accepted being sidelined. He'd spent his entire life accumulating power, and prison hadn't diminished his appetite for it. By the mid-1970s, he was openly campaigning to retake the Teamsters' presidency, despite the fact it was illegal for him to do so. He gave speeches, courted old allies, and told anyone who'd listen that he intended to take back what he considered his union. The problem was that during his years behind bars, the world had moved on, and the people who'd filled the vacuum had no interest in giving it back. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's hand-picked successor, had settled comfortably into the presidency. More importantly, the organized crime figures who controlled much of the union's financial infrastructure preferred Fitzsimmons. He was compliant and predictable, and for all his ample corruption, Hoffa was neither of those things. If he regained power, there was no telling what he might do or who he might expose. For the mob, Hoffa's comeback campaign was a problem that needed solving. The day Hoffa vanished started like any other. He left his summer home in Lake Orion, Michigan, around 1:15 in the afternoon and drove to the Pontiac office of his close friend. He told people he was heading to a 2 p.m. meeting at the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township with two men. One was Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mob figure, and the other was Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official and Genovese crime family captain. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant on time, but neither Giacalone nor Provenzano showed up. Sometime between 2:15 and 2:30, an increasingly agitated Hoffa called his wife from a payphone outside a hardware store behind the restaurant. He complained that the men hadn't appeared and said he'd be home by 4 o'clock. It was the last known communication anyone had with him. The FBI later estimated that Hoffa left the parking lot around 2:45 to 2:50 that afternoon, and that he didn't leave alone. The physical evidence in the case centered on that maroon 1975 Mercury Marquis. The car belonged to Joseph Giacalone, Anthony's son, and had been borrowed that day by Charles O'Brien, a man Hoffa had essentially raised as a foster son. O'Brien told investigators he'd used the car to deliver a 40-pound frozen salmon and that fish guts and fluids had leaked onto the back seat. And honestly, I just have to say here that the 40-pound frozen salmon excuse is the mob equivalent of "the dog ate my homework." This fish fluid apparently prompted him to take the vehicle to a car wash later that afternoon. It was a fishy story, and it didn't hold up well. Trained police dogs, given clothing Hoffa had worn the day before his disappearance, identified his scent in the back of the Mercury. A strand of his hair was later recovered from the back seat, and the feds concluded that O'Brien had driven the Mercury with Hoffa seated in the right rear. O'Brien denied involvement for the rest of his life. He claimed he was at the Southfield Athletic Club with Anthony Giacalone during the relevant hours. Neither Giacalone nor Provenzano could be placed at the restaurant that afternoon, and both denied having any meeting scheduled with Hoffa. No one at the athletic club or the car wash could ever be found to corroborate O'Brien's timeline. In the 5 decades since Hoffa vanished, theories about who pulled the trigger have multiplied. The most publicly prominent came from Frank Sheeran, a Teamsters official and alleged mob hitman who claimed late in life that he personally shot Hoffa inside a house in Detroit. That account formed the basis of a best-selling book and later, a major motion picture which I somehow haven't bothered to watch yet. But the claim has serious credibility problems, and when investigators tore up the floorboards of the house, Sheeran identified the genetic material recovered wasn't Hoffa's. The lead agent on the case in 2004 found little in Sheeran's confession that could be substantiated, and journalists who investigated the claims in detail reached the same conclusion. A more widely supported theory among investigators and organized crime researchers points to Salvatore Briguglio, a New Jersey associate of Provenzano's, as the likely triggerman. Briguglio was a known enforcer within the Genovese crime family, and multiple investigators have independently identified him as the most probable candidate. He was himself slain outside a restaurant in New York's Little Italy in 1978. Effectively closing that particular avenue of investigation. What isn't seriously disputed by anyone close to the case is the general framework. Hoffa was lured to the Machis Red Fox under the pretense of a sit-down meeting. He was picked up by people he trusted, or at the very least, recognized, and he was immediately eliminated, likely to keep him from taking over the Union again. The search for Hoffa's remains has become something of a grim American tradition. Investigators have dug up a horse farm in Milford Township, Michigan. They've investigated rumors that he was buried beneath the end zone at Giants Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. In 2021, a tip from the son of a former New Jersey landfill operator led the FBI to conduct a survey beneath the Pulaski Skyway in Jersey City. This was following a claim that Hoffa's body had been placed in a steel drum and buried there in 1975. Agents spent weeks digging, but they found nothing, and a spokesperson confirmed in 2022 that the search had yielded no evidence of value. After 5 decades, the physical remains of Jimmy Hoffa will almost certainly never be found. Whatever was done with his body was effective enough to withstand a half-century of investigation by the FBI. In the end, he was declared legally dead in 1982, 7 years after he vanished, and the case still remains officially open. A typewriter sitting in Stephen Marfeo's mother's house was matched to a pair of anonymous letters that told police exactly how he committed a horrific crime. These were letters that Stephen himself almost certainly typed, and somehow, even after all of that, nobody was ever charged. No body was ever found. The disappearance of Doreen Marfeo is one of the most disturbing cold cases I've ever covered, and perhaps the real mystery is how this case was never solved. Doreen Dobson met Stephen Marfeo in Rhode Island in 1976, when she was 21, and they married 2 years later on July 7, 1978. They settled on Hartford Avenue in Johnston, Rhode Island, a working-class suburb just west of Providence. Doreen was a purchasing director at the Rhode Island School of Design, and from what anyone could tell, she was good at it. She was a normal person living a normal life until the marriage had started to fracture. By the late 1980s, things between Doreen and Stephen were deteriorating badly enough that Doreen sought counseling. She eventually made a decision that, in hindsight, feels devastating. She quit her job to focus on saving the relationship. She walked away from a stable career with benefits and a professional reputation because she believed the marriage was worth fighting for. Whether Stephen felt the same way is a different question, because while Doreen was trying to fix things, Stephen had hired private investigators to follow her. He suspected she was having an affair, but the investigators tailed her and found no evidence of one. Despite this, his paranoia continued to grow, and he appears to have become increasingly obsessed by the unverified belief that his wife was cheating. On the morning of March 29, 1990, Stephen Marfeo went to work like any other day, but his lunch break that afternoon was fairly odd. Stephen typically took 20 to 30 minutes for lunch. That day, he took 70. He later told investigators that he'd gone home and eaten lunch with Doreen, then returned to work. When he got home around 4 in the afternoon, she was gone, at least. That's what he would claim. He said that a suitcase packed with about a week's worth of clothing had been taken, along with $600 from a small safe. But here's the thing. Doreen's 1984 Ford Tempo was still sitting in the driveway, and her 2 beloved cats were still in the house. Roughly $50,000 sat untouched in joint bank accounts which she could have accessed at any time. The story Stephen was selling was fairly implausible right from the start. His wife had spontaneously decided to leave him, packed a bag, grabbed $600 in cash, and then walked away from her car, her cats, and 50 grand in the bank. To make matters even more suspicious, she allegedly did so without telling her mother, to whom she spoke almost daily. To make matters more bizarre, Stephen waited 2.5 days to report her missing, despite freely admitting he knew she was gone immediately. For about 2.5 months, the case went essentially nowhere. Johnston police had a missing woman, a husband whose story didn't quite add up, and not much else. Then, on June 13th, 1990, an anonymous typed letter arrived at the Johnston Police Department, and a week later, a second one followed. The second letter laid out what allegedly happened. It described Stephen losing his temper after finding Doreen sleeping on the couch. According to the letter, he strangled her, stuffed her shoes and handbag into a shopping bag, and dumped her body in a pond somewhere in Providence. This letter described him as being highly skilled in deception, implying that the police shouldn't take his word at face value. The first letter took a different angle entirely, and it accused Doreen of carrying on affairs with multiple former co-workers. Police sent the letters to a psycholinguistics expert at Syracuse University for analysis, and his conclusion was blunt. Based on the language patterns, phrasing, and psychological profile embedded in the text, he determined that Stephen had very likely written both letters. He went further, stating that Stephen was a logical suspect in his wife's slaying, which personally to me seems fairly obvious. Despite this opinion of a forensic expert, no further evidence was recovered, and no charges were laid at that time. In July of 1991, more than a year after the letters arrived, police seized several typewriters that Stephen had access to, and they got a match. The first letter had been produced on a typewriter found in Stephen's mother's house. Stephen denied writing the letters, and he insisted the police were fabricating evidence. He lawyered up and stopped cooperating with the investigation, though the extent that he was truly cooperating to begin with is an open question. Despite this additional link to the crime, the police claimed they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, and for nearly a decade that's where things stood. But before I get into that, I want to take a bit of time to describe the somewhat unusual family dynamic, as well as a famous appearance by Stephen on national television. Doreen's mother, Laura Dobson, never stopped waiting for her daughter to walk through the door. What makes Laura's situation worse is that she apparently believed in Stephen's innocence. Even as investigators were pointing fingers squarely at her son-in-law, Laura reportedly described him as kind and supportive. Meanwhile, the case got a burst of national exposure in November 1993, when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. In a somewhat shocking twist, given who the prime suspect was, Stephen participated in the segment. He portrayed himself as a grieving husband who had been unfairly targeted by the police simply because he was the spouse. More insidiously, he also portrayed Doreen as someone who had started behaving erratically in the year before her disappearance. In retrospect, it appears that he had used the segment to build public credibility for his version of events, rather than any serious attempt to find his missing wife. The segment brought the story to tens of millions of living rooms across the country and generated a number of tips, none of which went anywhere. 9 years after Doreen disappeared, Stephen Marfeo told his family he was going on vacation to get his head straight. What happened next makes it very difficult to maintain any theory of Stephen's innocence. On July 30th, 1999, Stephen tracked down his estranged girlfriend, a 38-year-old woman named Laura Vincent. He fatally shot her and attempted to do the same to her boyfriend, but he survived despite sustaining severe injuries. After the shootings, Stephen got in his car and drove north to the Barkhamstead Reservoir, a remote, heavily wooded area in northwestern Connecticut. A state trooper spotted his vehicle and approached, but before the cop could reach him, Stephen pulled the curtains on his life. In his car, police found a letter addressed to his mother, where he explained why he committed these crimes. He described it as something he simply had to do, that talking to professionals or friends or family wasn't part of his plan. But the part of the note that investigators zeroed in on was his reference to Doreen. He expressed guilt over her disappearance and wrote that he'd been alive 9 years too long, a time frame that lined up exactly with how long Doreen had been missing. He didn't confess to anything specific, and he didn't say where her body was. He just carried whatever he knew with him to that reservoir in Connecticut, and whatever the truth was about Doreen Marfeo, it went to the grave with him. Personally, I think the picture here is about as clear as a circumstantial case gets. You've got a husband who took a suspiciously long lunch on the day his wife vanished, and a wife who left behind her car, her toothbrush, her cats, and $50,000. There was a 2.5-day gap before Stephen, who was an extremely paranoid person by all accounts, even bothered calling the police. There was also anonymous letters describing the method of her slaying, written on a typewriter from his own family's home, with a psycholinguistic profile pointing directly at him. And then, 9 years later, he produced a final letter referencing a sense of guilt about Doreen's disappearance, and a statement saying that's where his story should have come to an end. The only thing missing is a body, and that's been the case's curse from the beginning. Without physical remains, without forensic evidence tying Stephen to a specific act of violence, prosecutors never felt they had enough to bring charges. It's also worth noting that Stephen's 1999 rampage followed a pattern of escalating possessiveness and control. He couldn't accept Doreen's perceived independence, that she was getting promoted at work and doing well in life. 9 years later, he couldn't accept that another woman was moving on to another relationship, and if he couldn't have someone, nobody could. There's been some speculation about whether the Barkhamsted Reservoir might have held some significance beyond being a remote location. Some investigators have wondered whether it was chosen because Doreen's remains were somewhere nearby, though no search of the area has ever turned up anything conclusive. That could mean the theory is wrong, but it could also mean they haven't looked in the right spot. Connecticut has a lot of woodland and a lot of ponds and small lakes where a body could be hiding. 2 gas station attendants. That's the last thread connecting Elizabeth Kenyon to the world of the living. On March 5th, 1984, those 2 attendants saw a 23-year-old woman in the company of a man they'd later identify from photographs. After that sighting, Elizabeth Kenyon was never seen again, and the man beside her would go on to cut a path of terror across 8 states before meeting his end 6 weeks later. Elizabeth Kenyon lived in an apartment in Coral Gables, Florida, and she was the kind of person who stayed busy. She taught special education at Coral Gables Senior High School and coached the cheerleading squad. Before that, she'd been a cheerleader herself at the University of Miami, and she'd done some fashion modeling on the side and earned the title of Orange Bowl Princess in 1982. At some point before her disappearance, Elizabeth had dated a man named Christopher Wilder. He was a 38-year-old Australian-born real estate developer living in Boynton Beach, about 25 miles south of Palm Beach. He had money, drove nice cars, traveled frequently to Hawaii and the Bahamas, and had a serious interest in photography. On paper, he looked like a successful middle-aged bachelor working his way through the world, but unfortunately for Elizabeth, none of it was true. His criminal record stretched back to his teenage years in Sydney, where at 17 he'd participated in a disturbing assault on a woman at a quarry. The court gave him 1 year of probation and mandatory counseling that included electroshock therapy. He emigrated to the United States in 1969 and settled in South Florida, despite his severe criminal record. By 1983, he'd been identified by 2 girls in Boynton Beach as the man who abducted them and forced them into disturbing acts. Criminal charges were pending at the time, but despite this disturbing turn of events, Wilder decided this was the ideal time to propose marriage to Elizabeth. Elizabeth would ultimately say no, though it appears that she had no idea about his ongoing criminal charges. The evening before she vanished, Elizabeth had driven up to Pompano Beach to visit her parents. She stayed until about 9 o'clock that evening and got home around 10. The next day, March 5th, she went to work at Coral Gables High as usual. At roughly 3 in the afternoon, a school security guard and a police officer stationed on campus saw her in the parking lot. She spoke to them briefly, then got into her Chrysler convertible carrying a duffel bag with workout clothes and a curling iron inside, and she drove away. She never came home that night, and she didn't show up for work on March 6th. Her purse was left behind, which, last I checked, isn't the sort of thing a woman leaves if she's planning a trip. 6 days later, on March 11th, her Chrysler convertible turned up abandoned at Miami International Airport. A review of flight manifests suggested that the car sitting in that airport lot was a prop in someone else's staging, not evidence of a voluntary departure. The investigation centered on Wilder almost immediately, since the boyfriend or the spouse is usually the prime suspect. 2 gas station attendants near Miami identified him from photographs as the man who'd been with Kenyon on the day she disappeared. More damning still, when interviewed by the cops, Wilder somehow knew the location of her car before that information had been released to the press. But Elizabeth Kenyon wasn't the first person who was connected to Wilder to disappear that year. 8 days before her disappearance, on February 26th, a 20-year-old aspiring model named Rosario Gonzalez vanished from the Miami Grand Prix. She'd been working as a temporary spokesmodel handing out samples to guests, and she had previously modeled for Wilder. Wilder was also confirmed to have been in attendance that day, and she was seen in the presence of a white male when she was leaving the event. Christopher Wilder was never firmly linked to her disappearance, but he remains the prime suspect. After Kenyon, Wilder's pace accelerated, and in total, Wilder is confirmed to have slain at least 8 women during his 6-week spree, with additional victims suspected. He earned the nickname the Beauty Queen Killer, a nod to his method of targeting attractive young women through offers of modeling and photography. The end came on April 13, 1984. Wilder pulled into a service station in Colebrook, New Hampshire, a small town just south of the Canadian border. He asked for directions to Canada, apparently hoping to flee the country. 2 New Hampshire State Police troopers approached him, and rather than cooperating, Wilder went back to his car and reached for a pistol. One trooper grabbed Wilder from behind in an attempt to restrain him, and in the violent struggle that followed, 2 shots went off, with one hitting Wilder square in the chest. Wilder didn't make it, and with his passing, the whereabouts of numerous young women would be forever sealed. More than 4 decades have passed, and Elizabeth Kenyon's remains have never been found. No crime scene has ever been identified, and no witnesses have come forward with new information. The physical evidence amounts to an abandoned car in an airport parking lot and 2 eyewitness identifications at a gas station. Everything else is built on the overwhelming circumstantial case against a man who can't be questioned and whose full crimes will likely never be known. What's up, everyone? It's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to consider checking out the membership or the Patreon if you want to take your support to the next level. A farmer outside Cleburne, Texas, noticed the birds first, vultures circling low over the wooded edge of his property. On December 11th, 1972, after a few days of noticing these birds, he went to check. What he found among the trees wasn't a coyote or a deer carcass. It was a human body. A police investigation would reveal that despite the body being badly scavenged by animals, there was still 2 visible wounds to the chest. Aside from that, there was absolutely nothing to identify who this man was, and more than 50 years later, this is where the case would remain. The case would come to be known as Mr. X, and it's one of Johnson County's longest-running unsolved slayings. During a forensic examination, 2 wounds were determined to have been inflicted by a .25 caliber weapon. Notably, no spent shell casings were found at the scene, which told investigators that the victim almost certainly hadn't been shot where he was found. Someone had eliminated this man somewhere else, transported his body to this remote stretch of farmland northwest of Cleburne, and left him in the trees. The location was roughly 14 miles outside of town, far enough from any main road to avoid notice. Investigators at the time estimated the victim was a white male, or possibly Hispanic, and somewhere between 30 and 50 years old. His physical profile was the only thing they had to work with, and it wasn't much. No fingerprint match came back, and no dental records matched any missing person in the system. Local and regional news covered the discovery, but nobody came forward, and for reasons that will become obvious shortly, there may have been a reason no one recognized the man. After exhausting the identification methods available to them in 1972, authorities buried the man in a pauper's grave at Rose Hill Cemetery in Cleburne. He was given the name Mr. X on his burial record, a placeholder that was never meant to last this long, but the case went cold. During the next 40 years, forensic science changed completely. Johnson County formed its own cold case squad, and in 2012, someone pulled the Mr. X file. For the first time in decades, investigators took a fresh look at the evidence, and it didn't take long for them to decide the remains needed to come out of the ground. In August 2013, Mr. X was exhumed from Rose Hill Cemetery. The remains were sent for modern forensic analysis, including genetic testing. The results changed the profile of the victim substantially and indicated that the original investigators were on the wrong trail. As I had mentioned, the original 1972 estimate had placed the man's age between 30 and 50. New analysis revised that range dramatically downward, likely placing him in his very late teens or early 20s. That age revision reframed the entire case, and the fact that no one reported him took on a different weight. Teenagers and young adults don't generally just vanish without someone noticing, unless they were already disconnected from whatever support system they'd once had. Runaways, drifters, and people who'd aged out of the foster system or left home under bad circumstances. These are the people who vanish without anyone filing a report. As of the most recent updates, Mr. X remains unidentified, but there's good news on the horizon. The DNA Doe Project has taken up work on the case and are applying modern genetic genealogy techniques to the investigations. If Mr. X had any connection to his biological family, this will almost certainly yield his name and identity, which would allow the authorities to begin the next stage of the investigation. Ultimately, though, one of the potential problems with a case like this is that our John Doe could have been adopted or could have spent his life in the foster system. If he was adopted, it's possible that genetic genealogy will be an entire dead end, especially given the shoddy adoption record system that existed at the time. If the foster system was at play, he may get his name back, but not much more, since he may have been entirely estranged from his biological family. There is, of course, a much darker reason why he may not have been reported missing. As with any case involving genetic genealogy, where there are few details known about the crime, there's the possibility that his family was responsible. I remain fairly confident that we'll see a significant breakthrough in this case in the very near future. There's even the possibility, however faint that it might be, that uncovering the John Doe's identity will lead to true justice in his case. But for now, Mr. X is still out there at Rose Hill Cemetery in Cleburne, Texas, buried under that placeholder name, a young man that apparently nobody came looking for. On the night of November 1st, 1916, a retired Marine sergeant boarded a Baltimore Steam Packet Company steamer somewhere along the Chesapeake Bay. By the time the vessel reached its destination on November 2nd, he was gone. The man who'd once held a defensive line against hundreds of enemy fighters in the jungles of Samoa had simply vanished from the deck of a passenger ship. His name was Michael McNally, a Medal of Honor recipient. Until this day, his disappearance remains a historic unsolved mystery. McNally was born on June 29, 1860 in New York City. Not much survives about his early life, which isn't unusual for men of his generation who didn't come from money or prominence. What we do know is that he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in December 1897, shipping out from Mare Island, California. He was 37 years old at the time, which made him substantially older than most recruits. Whatever drove him to military service at that age, it wasn't a young man's impulse. It was a decision made by someone who understood what he was signing up for. Within 2 years of enlisting, McNally would find himself in the middle of a conflict that most Americans have never heard of. The conflict erupted in 1898 over control of the Samoan Islands, with Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States all backing different factions in a succession dispute. By early 1899, the situation had deteriorated into open combat, and American forces were directly involved. On April 1st, 1899, a joint Anglo-American expedition launched an assault on the Vailele plantation on the island of Upolu. The force was modest by any standard: 26 Marines, 88 sailors, and about 136 Samoan allies loyal to one faction. They marched inland from the coast to attack the plantation's defensive positions from the landward side, moving beyond the protective range of naval cannons. It was a bad call, and once the landing party moved inland, Allied ships ceased bombardment to avoid hitting friendly forces. At that exact moment, the column walked straight into an ambush. Over 800 heavily armed Samoan rebels, loyal to the German-backed leader, had concealed themselves in the dense jungle. Armed with modern German weaponry, they began unleashing immediately. McNally and 2 other Americans fortified an area of the jungle and held the position and held off a force that outnumbered them by an absurd margin while their comrades retreated. Once the main body withdrew, McNally and his 2 companions stayed until the job was done. For McNally, the near immediate outcome was a Medal of Honor, while the larger political outcome was the Tripartite Convention of 1899. This treaty carved up the Samoan Islands between the United States and Germany, with Britain ceding its claims in exchange for territorial concessions elsewhere. McNally retired from the Marine Corps in January 1915 after roughly 17 years of service at the ripe age of 54. Whatever his plans for civilian life looked like, he had less than 2 years left to carry them out. And those final 2 years are almost entirely blank, except for his disappearance. The circumstances of his final night are frustratingly sparse, much like most of his life in general, at least outside of his military years. On the night of November 1st, 1916, McNally was aboard a steamer operated by the Baltimore Steam Packet Company. This was a line that ran regular passenger service through the Chesapeake Bay region. At some point during the night or early morning of November 2nd, he went missing from the vessel. Whether he fell, jumped, or met with foul play, nobody could say, and no explanation presented itself to the crew. In fact, bizarrely, it appears that there was only a cursory investigation, and it's unclear to what extent the authorities were involved at all. The country had bigger things on its mind in 1916, and a retired Medal of Honor recipient disappearing from a passenger steamer barely registered. McNally's body was recovered approximately 3 weeks after his disappearance, sometime in late November 1916. He was buried in Portsmouth, Virginia, in a national cemetery alongside other veterans. Without surviving investigative records from either the steamer company or the police, any discussion of what happened to McNally on that steamer is speculative. The possibilities are the usual ones that attach to people going missing from ships: an accidental fall, a medical emergency that sent him over the railing, or a deliberate act. None of these can be confirmed or ruled out with the available information, simply because his disappearance was never properly investigated. An accidental fall is probably the simplest explanation, since steamers of that era weren't designed with modern safety standards in mind. Railings were lower, lighting was poor, and nighttime conditions on the Chesapeake in early November would have been cold and dark. A single misstep on a slick deck, a moment of disorientation, and the freezing water below would have done the rest in minutes. Notably, many have found it odd that a man who survived close-quarters combat against overwhelming odds in the South Pacific ended up slipping off a boat 17 years later. Those who believe in this theory suggest that perhaps something more nefarious happened, that perhaps he was pushed off, or the victim of a robbery gone wrong. Again, of course, there's simply no evidence to suggest this was the case, because virtually no investigation was ever done. For people who believe the foul play theory, I think it's largely because it just doesn't seem like a correct end for someone who had displayed such acts of bravery throughout his life. In a way, McNally's passing reminds me of an ancient Greek, or perhaps more precisely, Homeric tradition. Ancient Greeks had difficulty accepting that brave warriors who had achieved greatness could simply perish from some absolutely mundane cause. It doesn't seem right or proper that someone like McNally, who had been hailed as a hero, could simply fall off a ship at night and virtually immediately be forgotten. $33 million. That's what Nina Wong paid the first time someone took her husband. She paid it without hesitation and without negotiating, and the people watching, the gangs and criminal networks that stretched across Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China, took notes. Nina Wong had just proven something dangerous. The Wong family would pay, and 7 years later, someone came to collect again. This time, though, Nina's husband Teddy Wong didn't come home, and he hasn't been seen for decades. Born in Shanghai in 1933, Wang Te-hui, as he was then known, grew up in a family that traded in paint and chemicals. His father, Wang Din-shin, moved the family to Hong Kong in the early 1950s as the political situation on the mainland deteriorated. It was there that he adopted the name Teddy and reconnected with Nina Kung Yu Sum, a woman he'd known in his youth, and they married in 1955. 5 years later, Teddy and his father founded China Chem Investment Company. The name was a portmanteau of China and chemicals, but Teddy had wider ambitions than the name suggested. By the mid-1960s, he'd pivoted the company toward real estate, and that decision turned out to be one of the best bets anyone made during Hong Kong's economic boom. China Chem built industrial buildings first, then office towers, then shopping complexes. By 1988, the company completed China Chem Golden Plaza, one of the territory's recognizable landmarks. By 1990, the China Chem empire stretched across Hong Kong, the United Kingdom, the United States, Taiwan, and Canada. Teddy Wong was a billionaire, one of the richest people in the world, and in a territory that small, everybody knew it. On April 12, 1983, Teddy and Nina were riding in their Mercedes when a group of heavily armed men hijacked the car. Nina was blindfolded and shoved aside, while Teddy was forced into a truck and driven to a location where he was chained to a bed for 8 days. The kidnappers, a Taiwanese organized crime group, demanded millions, and Nina paid without hesitation. The kidnapping proved two things at once: that Teddy Wong was worth taking, and that his family would hand over staggering sums to get him back. In a city where billionaire families clustered together in a tiny territory with extraordinary visible wealth, that combination was an open invitation. Other Hong Kong tycoons would face similar threats in the years that followed, but Teddy was the first, and his case set the template. Pay the money, get the man back, move on with life. For most people who had gone through this process, they relocated overseas. Teddy didn't, and 7 years later, it happened again. On April 10th, 1990, Teddy left the Hong Kong Jockey Club and walked into an ambush. Multiple assailants moved on him in what was clearly a well-planned, coordinated extraction. The kidnappers contacted Nina and demanded $60 million. She paid nearly half as a first installment, and then she waited. But to her surprise, Teddy didn't come back. There was no second call with instructions for the remaining payment, and most disturbingly of all, there was no proof of life. What Nina didn't know yet was that this operation dwarfed the 1983 kidnapping in scope. Police would eventually discover that the gang operated across 3 jurisdictions: Hong Kong, mainland China, and Taiwan. The ransom money moved from Hong Kong to Taiwan, and Teddy himself was moved onto the Chinese mainland. The gang used separate cells that operated independently, which meant that even if one group got caught, the others could keep running, so long as they weren't the cell with Teddy himself. The mastermind, police would later determine, was a retired Hong Kong police sergeant. He was a man who understood exactly how police investigations worked, what evidence they looked for, and how to stay one step ahead. There were arrests early on, and members of the gang told a consistent story during their interrogations. The only problem is that the story was perhaps too consistent, and investigators believed that it may have been a cover story. They said Teddy was thrown into the South China Sea on April 13th, 1990, 3 days after his abduction. Between 1991 and 1993, Hong Kong police arrested 6 more people connected to the operation. They all corroborated the idea that Teddy had been tossed into the sea and nobody would ever find him, but then things got genuinely strange. Nina continued to receive phone calls from Teddy after his disappearance and well after he was supposedly tossed in the sea. These calls continued over the course of a decade, possibly longer, with the last publicly known call occurring around the year 2000. When proceedings began to have Teddy declared dead, she resisted, pointing to those calls as proof her husband was alive somewhere. She even prepared estate documents that assumed his eventual return, that she would just be managing his portfolio in trust until he came back. But the courts weren't convinced, and in 1999, 9 years after the kidnapping, a Hong Kong court declared Teddy Wong legally deceased. The ruling allowed Chinachem to function without the legal ambiguity of a missing chairman. It also gave Nina full authority over the business empire, authority that she believed was still rightfully her husband's. Personally, I think there are only 3 real possibilities here, and none of them are satisfying. The first is that Teddy escaped from his captors and went into hiding. In this scenario, perhaps the kidnappers lost control of him. Or maybe he cut a separate deal with one of the semi-independent cells that was holding him. From there, it's possible that he went underground in an effort to protect his family from further attacks by this multinational criminal network. If the calls were real, and Nina knew her husband very well, I suspect this is most likely true, but it doesn't explain why he never returned. The second is that the kidnappers kept him alive for years. They held him, moved him between locations across the mainland, and used the calls as part of an ongoing extortion scheme. When he eventually perished in captivity, they simply disposed of his body and moved on with their lives. The third is that the kidnappers told the truth about April 13th, but lied about everything else. He went into the South China Sea 3 days after they grabbed him. The phone calls were something else: hoaxes, impersonators, or a grieving widow hearing what she needed to hear. Nina Wang took over China Chem and ran it for 17 years. She expanded the company's real estate holdings across Asia and beyond, and by the time she passed away in 2007, she was the richest woman in Asia. She'd taken a company that lost its founder to kidnapping and turned it into one of Hong Kong's largest property developers. But even Nina's death didn't end the story. In 2002, she'd written a will leaving her entire fortune to the China Chem Charitable Foundation. After she died, her feng shui advisor, a man named Peter Chan, produced a second will dated 2006 that left everything to him. The foundation challenged it as a forgery, and in 2010, a civil court agreed and ruled the 2006 will was fraudulent. Then in 2013, a criminal jury convicted Chan of forging it outright, reaching their verdict after 20 hours of deliberation. The feng shui fraudster got 12 years in the slammer, and Nina's billions went to her charitable foundation, as she'd wanted. Somewhere around 1980, in the high pine country outside Flagstaff, Arizona, someone stumbled onto what was left of a man. All that remained was a skeleton, a rusted old revolver, and scattered around his body, a collection of newspapers dating back to the 1950s. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office opened a case file, logged the remains, and waited for a name, but over 4 decades later, they're still waiting. The John Doe ended up earning the name the Flagstaff Cowboy due to his remains being found somewhat near to a location called the Cowboy Country Club. And yeah, it looks like they chose to spell that name with 3 Ks, hence the spelling of cowboy with a K. So yeah, make of that what you will. Might not have been a friendly place, so to speak. The remains weren't found in 1980 because that's when this man perished, and the cops quickly determined he had been there for a long time. The newspapers found alongside his body suggest he'd been deceased for decades by the time anyone located him. But there was more evidence to suggest that the remains had been out there for a long time. 20 years before the rest of the skeleton turned up, someone found a lone human skull, and it went into the evidence locker where it remained. It was later determined that the exact skull belonged to the same individual whose skeleton was found in the early 80s, though it looks like that connection may have been made decades later. Investigators estimated he was a white male, somewhere between 35 and 65 years old at the time of his passing, standing around 5 feet 8 inches tall. The condition of the remains made narrowing that age range almost impossible. Decades of exposure to northern Arizona's dry heat, freezing winters, and rainy seasons had done their work. The rusted revolver found near the site indicated to the police that there was likely no foul play involved. That said, personally I have some doubts, since it remains possible that the perpetrator could have dumped the weapon right there, given how remote the location was. As of 2026, this John Doe's case has been referred for genetic genealogy testing, though the exact status of the investigation is unknown. Given that he passed away in the 1950s, locating any living relatives who have any meaningful memories of this individual might be difficult. However, at the very least, this process may be able to give this John Doe his name back and help determine how he met his end. Of course, even if foul play was involved, given that the crime happened in the 1950s, the perpetrator, if there was one, will almost certainly never face justice. As a quick aside, I find something so incredibly compelling about these Doe cases that got essentially no attention at the time. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The only way these unidentified people will ever get their name back is if they're remembered and talked about. So if you live in the jurisdiction where the cowboy Doe was recovered, feel free to email the authorities and ask for a quick status update on the case. Something so small could be the final push it takes for this or any other Doe case to finally get resolved.